said, most countries didn't send equipment right out of their own arsenals, but rather, bought it, had it procured through their defense industry. In fact, Ukraine, especially from Eastern Europe, got a lot of kind of old Soviet equipment that they really knew how to use, so this was great. But this also means that these countries can now replace these systems that they gave away with newer systems, and that's what they're doing.
NATO doesn't have its own armed force. It works with national ones. A key part of its treaty says an attack on one member state will be seen as an attack on all the others. But that's not the only collective security agreement.
27 European countries are a member of the European Union, and the European Union Treaty has Article 42.7, and that is also a mutual defense clause. In addition, there are bilateral treaties between countries, say France and Germany, France and Greece, things like that, where they again reinforce this notion of if you get attacked, we will help you. All that being said, NATO really is the player in town when it comes to military capabilities in Europe. NATO is what allows European militaries to get organized, to work together. There are military commands, there are structures, there's a history of doing this, and so without NATO it would be much harder for Europeans to work together.
How a European army would operate hasn't been defined, but there are some suggestions for how it might be formed. They include merging all existing forces into one, or keeping national armed forces in place and creating a joint additional one.
It's rare that people who make this proposal actually spell out what they mean and what they're willing to give up here. Countries will have to give up certain things. They may have to give up some financial gains from their arms industry, right? Because it may not be their arms industry that provides the weapons for this European army. They will have to give up sovereign rights, so the sovereign right to decide where to send soldiers or not. And for many European countries, I want to say pretty much all, armed forces are an element of national pride.
Governments would also have to agree on who would command the new force, where from, which language to speak, and what equipment to use.
I would think that there are so many practical issues with regard to creating some kind of unified European military force that it does become practically impossible.
Time for our next expert witness.
Part 3. A rebalancing act.
I don't expect to see a European Union army, at least not over the next decade or so, just like I don't expect to see a decoupling of the United States from Europe.
Oana Lungescu is a distinguished fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, the UK-based security and defence think tank. She's also a former NATO spokesperson.
What I do expect is a rebalanced NATO with less America and more Europe, with stronger European armed forces and capabilities, and closer cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And I think that could ultimately be a win-win for both Europe and the United States.
Potential reactions to a European military force, and the two countries often mentioned as reasons for needing one, might sound inconsistent.
In the past, Russian propaganda has, perhaps paradoxically, supported the idea of a European Union army because it was an opportunity to fuel divisions between Europeans and Americans. Actually, they would also be concerned at the same time about anything that would strengthen the defense of European countries with more capabilities and more defense spending.
As for the US,
the calls from the United States for Europe to do more for its own defense go back many decades, basically to President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Obama, President Biden, and of course President Trump, both in his first and now in his second administration. And it is a justified question. Why would the United States invest so much in the defense of Europe if Europeans themselves don't really care about their own defense?
however, a breakaway European army might not be the answer it wants.
That could risk weakening America's ties with its oldest and closest allies. It would also show that Europe and America are going their separate ways at a time when their adversaries are aligning much closer together, as we can see in Russia's war in Ukraine. And of course, if a European Union army proved unable to defend the continent in the event of Russia reconstituting itself within 3 to 5 years, as most military analysts expect, then the United States might find itself drawn back to the defense of the continent, as happened both in World War I and World War II.
In January 2025, months before Spain's Prime Minister called for a European army, the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, said it wasn't needed.
And I note that Antonio Costa, who's the president of the European Council, the body which brings together the 27 EU governments, made clear just the other day that nobody is talking about an European army, but a strong collective defense and deterrence within NATO, with the alliance setting out the defense plans and the capabilities that need to be filled to implement those plans, and European Union countries investing much more together and boosting their capabilities.
The US is shifting its foreign policy to other parts of the world, and Europe faces many dangers.
The issue for NATO is always transatlantic unity, because that is the strongest signal of deterrence that the 32 allies can send, that they stand together, united, ready to defend and protect each other.
In June 2025, President Trump put forward a senior commander to lead US and NATO forces in Europe. US officers have filled that critical security role since 1951.
The fact that an American Air Force Lieutenant General has been nominated by the President to be the next Supreme Allied Commander Europe from this summer, once confirmed by the US Senate, is indeed a sign that the United States remains committed, remains involved in NATO, which is basically what this administration has been saying, that they remain committed to NATO, but they want the Europeans and indeed the Canadians to do much more, to become much stronger partners in the alliance.
Heads of state and government leaders are due in The Hague within days for the June NATO summit. President Trump will be there.
The focus of the summit will be money. So I would expect a rather short summit focused on agreeing on 5% of GDP on defense over the next decade or so, and also focusing on the need to boost the defense industry across the Euro-Atlantic area and in particular in Europe. Because the reality is Europeans are still not producing at speed and at scale what is needed to defend Europe. So there is still a lot of work to be done, and this is a moment when it has to be done.
Funding a new European army also sounds financially impossible, as governments play catch-up with existing defence commitments. Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. Plugging holes.
Today, all European countries really massively increased their defense spending. Some more massively than others, but there definitely is a general trend in Europe to spend more for our own defense.
Dr. Sven Bischkop is a professor at Ghent University in Belgium.
There will be billions more spent across Europe, and one should not forget the European Union as such is also spending money on defense industry from its own budget.
He also leads the Europe and the World programme at the Egmont Institute in Brussels. Defence spending is usually shown as a percentage of national income, or GDP. That makes it easier to compare across countries.
Since the end of the Cold War, many countries, especially in Western Europe, had disinvested from defense, and many went very far. They dropped to just about 1% of GDP, and that's just not enough to maintain a credible armed force. The problem is that by cutting so deep, we cut away often the structures and the expertise that allow us to rebuild the force when necessary.
Poland is a leading investor in its military and expects to spend 4.7% of GDP on it this year. Lithuania plans to allocate between 5 and 6% over 5 years from 2026. It had been around 3%.
Those are, of course, the countries that feel most directly threatened by Russia. But also my own country, for example, Belgium, suddenly decided to go from 1.3% of GDP to 2% of GDP defense spending just in a couple of months. So you can really see there's a sense of urgency across the continent.
And the equipment shopping list is extensive.
The challenge for Europe is this. American and European forces altogether constitute a complete package of military force. But think away the Americans, and then there are many areas in which there is almost zero European capability. And those are the very expensive items: military satellites, secure communications, transport aircraft, missile defense, our own offensive missiles. So these are items that no single European country will be able to afford on its own. So the challenge is to also pool some of the additional defense spending to plug those holes which the drawing down of the American conventional contribution will leave.
So where will the extra money to pay for it all come from?
Many states will, of course, have to fund the additional defense effort by borrowing money. States will have to make choices and perhaps cut back on other spending. But one should not forget that all of us did this in the past. Until the end of the Cold War, until late 80s, early 90s, all Western European countries were somewhere between 3 and 4% of GDP, and we were not impoverished societies at that time. For those who are also members of the European Union, the EU will help there to lend money at a cheap rate, and it will also make available money from its own budget for the defence industry.
The UK isn't an EU member, but it is in NATO. It plans to fund its increase in defence spending by cutting its foreign aid budget. 11 years ago, NATO members agreed to commit 2% of GDP to defence to maintain military readiness. According to NATO estimates, 23 of the 32 states have done that.
NATO allies have now proposed a double target, so the core defence spending should be raised to 3.5%, but then they want to add to that 1.5% investment in defense infrastructure for a total of 5%. Think of investing in port infrastructure or in railways that we would not normally count as part of the defense budget. But we should be careful indeed, because there will be voices who will in the end push for a full 5% on core defense spending on military kit, and that is actually not necessary. But the 3.5% ought to be feasible because all of us did it during the Cold War.
So with countries spending more, how closer does that move Europe towards greater self-reliance?
I feel that in financial terms, the efforts that are now being made, they are sufficient to kickstart it. Now, European leaders must take the political initiatives and decide what exactly are we going to do with this. The idea is not to go against the United States, of course, but we must prepare for a scenario in which we will have to fight a major war on our own, at least in the first instance, because simply the Americans might be otherwise engaged. So if we just spend more money, but we remain as dependent on American enablers as before, then it is almost meaningless.
So are we closer to a European army? No. Many European countries inside and outside the EU have ramped up defence spending, but they're not ready to go it alone without some US involvement. Participating governments would have to borrow or make cuts elsewhere to fund a new force. Even heavily pro-European populations are likely to resist that. The cost isn't only financial. An integrated force means the end of sovereign rights over military decisions. It also needs unity to function. Overcoming the challenges involved is an uphill battle. So for now, it remains an undefined, unfeasible, and politically divisive idea. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier. The producer was Daniel Rosny, researcher Maeve Sheffer, editor Tara McDermott, and technical producer Toby James.
The BBC World Service connects audiences to the world. From international news to science, sports, arts and culture programming, BBC World Service offers listeners a global perspective. Distribution of the BBC World Service in the U.S. is made possible by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that inform and inspire, entertain and engage audiences everywhere.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa
is provided by the Kendall College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Tulsa, helping students transform their passions into fulfilling professions and meaningful lives. More at artsandsciences.utulsa.edu.
National Public Radio from the University of Tulsa. Public Radio 89.5 KWGS HD1 Tulsa.
Welcome to Assignment on the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Kenyon, and this week I'm following the trail of the UK's fastest growing drug, ketamine. It's causing bladder damage and death around the world, but it's boom time for some criminal gangs. They make more from selling ketamine than cocaine. But where does it come from? How's it become so prevalent, and why is it so difficult for the police to stop? That's Assignment, the ketamine trail, after the news.
BBC News with Govinda Gill. The Iranian Foreign Minister has accused Donald Trump of betraying the American people as well as Iran by bombing its main nuclear sites. Speaking in Istanbul hours after the attacks, Abbas Araghchi said the US had crossed a big red line. He said Tehran reserved all options in defending itself. Mr. Araghchi said he would travel to Moscow to consult President Putin. President Trump says the US strikes totally obliterated the nuclear sites at Fordo, Isfahan and Natanz. He warned of further attacks if Iran didn't negotiate. Iran is investigating the scale of the damage, but insists that nuclear material was removed in advance. The UN nuclear watchdog said there had been no increase in radiation levels nearby. The Israeli Prime Minister praised Mr. Trump for acting with strength. He predicted the strikes would change history. The UN Secretary General has described the US action as a direct threat to international peace and security. Antonio Guterres said there was a growing risk that the conflict could spiral beyond control with catastrophic results. Within the past hour, China has strongly condemned the attacks. In Israel, more than 80 people have been hurt by the latest Iranian missile attack. Most were in and around Tel Aviv. Nearly all suffered minor injuries. In other news, Ukraine says its troops are still holding a small area of territory inside Russia's Kursk region, despite a months-long counter-offensive by Moscow's forces. Indian investigators have arrested 2 people for allegedly harbouring gunmen who killed 26 people in the disputed Kashmir region in April. Tens of thousands of supporters of the governing party in Ivory Coast have filled a stadium where President Alassane Ouattara is expected to announce that he's running for re-election in October.
This is Assignment from the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Kenyon, this week reporting on a global drugs trade.
Yeah, Foxtrot 82, we're currently with that section of vehicles stopped on the industrial estate. Orange powder, large amounts.
We're on the trail of the UK's fastest growing drug.
Yeah, just confirmed one box opened and a large quantity of white powder.
Put that in, that will come up specifically ketamine.
So this emoji is code between people who know, and it stands for you want ketamine.
Yeah.
Ketamine claimed the life of the American actor Matthew Perry, raising the profile of the drug and the damage that it can cause. But for the dealers, they've never had it so good.
Criminal gangs can make more profit at this moment, so doing business with ketamine.
We're following the supply routes across Europe.
It has a street value of approximately 55 million euros.
Places where it's not even classified as a narcotic.
But it's like ketamine is also a medicine.
So where's it made? And why does no one seem able to stop it?
It's too easy to say, yeah, but we produce it legally, and for the rest it's not our problem. In one way they have also responsibility, in my opinion.
We take you from a small northern town in England to the starting point of the ketamine trail.
It's police here.
6 a.m. in a neatly kept home near Burnley in the north of England. Photos on the wall, mum and dad preparing breakfast. Police have arrived as part of a series of raids on suspected ketamine dealers. Sergeant Vic Brownlee realises something isn't right.
The smell of urine as we entered the premises was really, really strong. We've gone upstairs to speak to him and we noticed all on the bathroom floor is urine floor is stained with it.
Do you want to get yours something now? I just need to chat with you, that's all.
A teenage boy they're looking for is just out of bed, in his boxer shorts, pale, vulnerable.
His bedding was wet through where he'd been going to the toilet in his bed, unfortunately, and the smell was really, really strong.
They call for face masks, but already they know the cause. Ketamine abuse can lead to severe bladder problems and even death while users are high on the drug. But Burnley police haven't seen anything like this before.
So we opened the bedside drawer. There was a plate in there where he'd emptied his bowels on, unfortunately, because of the pain he was in.
Sergeant Bramley is visibly shaken. They need to search further for ketamine, but keep discovering soiled kitchenware in the boy's cupboards and drawers.
And it was just devastating to see he's in too much pain to go to the toilet, that he's having to do it in his own bedroom where he should be sleeping. And it was very upsetting for the officers to see that. This is a child from our community who, unfortunately, due to his ket use, is left in with these medical conditions which are irreversible.
So at this moment in time, you're under arrest for being concerned in the supply of a Class B drug. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm you.
In that same operation, in mill towns and hillside villages around Burnley, 14 other, mainly young men, are arrested for similar ketamine offences. But it could have been any small town in the UK. Burnley's no exception. Inspector Matt Plummer was in charge of the raids and was shocked by just how young the suspects were.
It's almost seen as socially acceptable, I guess, amongst children. It's not seen as a hardcore drug. We're seeing they're young lads, and they are generally driving around in nice cars, using it to fund maybe their own habits as well on top.
And where are they getting it from?
We've got an idea, but that's very much ongoing and part of a live investigation, so that'll come out in the wash.
So where does it come from, and how does it get into the UK?
Yeah, Foxtrot exit. We're currently with that second vehicle stopped on the industrial estate.
Police are stopping a couple of vans near an A road in East Sussex on the south coast of England. We're hearing the recordings from their body cams.
Everything you say is being recorded, okay?
DC Laura Pettit was one of the detectives involved.
It was very fast-paced. Officers were trying to get there quickly to stop these two vans. One of the vans was stopped in the Premier Inn car park in Maresfield in East Sussex.
It's just a white van, nothing unusual from the outside, nothing particularly unusual on the inside, just a pile of brown cardboard boxes, each the size of a dishwasher, carefully sealed with masking tape.
They opened the back of the vans and saw that there were 15 boxes in each van. They opened one to see what was in it, and they could see that at a very early stage they contained drugs.
One box opened and a large quantity of white powder.
It's a sensational find. More than 600 kilograms of ketamine. That's the weight of a small car, with a street value of £18 million. It's one of the largest seizures of the drug in the UK in a record-breaking year. The number of ketamine seizures last year was up by 51% on the previous year, with an average of 6 seizures every day.
Picking up the weight of those bags was just huge. It took 2 of us to lift out and put in an exhibit bag, so that's going to be distributed up and down the UK and out into our communities. And it is an eye-opener that it's happening.
The consignment arrived through the port of Newhaven on the English Channel. The driver is a 32-year-old woman called Charlotte Moore, alongside her boyfriend, Stephen Norris. But when they put Moore's fingerprints into the system, there was a twist. They found them all over packages from another drug run earlier that same year, trying to bring cocaine into the UK. On that occasion, mobile phone analysis placed her further afield than southern England.
We learnt more about their case in such that Charlotte Moore and Mr. Norris were over in Belgium and looking at the phones. There's more than one a day loaded and coming in and shipping in, so...
Is that what you think, really? More than one a day? Coming in from where?
All over Europe, but predominantly France or Belgium.
Despite its dangers, ketamine has a rather ambiguous legal status, depending on where you are in Europe. In some European countries, it can be imported as a pharmaceutical product in large quantities with less stringent checks. While in others, like the UK, the law is tighter. Ketamine is classified as a narcotic, and it's those inconsistent laws that have attracted organised crime groups. So, to trace the supply of ketamine back along the chain, we headed for Belgium.
In 1 kilometre, keep left.
It's a rain-swept day in West Flanders, and we're meeting up with local crime reporter Linda Walters.
There's not a lot going on here, so I'm guessing you can stay inconspicuous. I don't think a lot of people worry about drugs. They don't know about drugs, so it's the last thing on your mind.
She takes us to an industrial estate just a few minutes' drive from the French border, close to Calais and Dunkirk.
Some passerby saw something strange going on and he called the police.
What kind of strange thing?
Apparently he saw a few men moving boxes, IKEA boxes by the way, moving them from a rented van into a lorry with British license plates. Also the lorry was already filled with frozen products, so normally you don't put IKEA boxes in the back of the lorry. So the police managed to track down the van, and based on the track and trace, they could follow its activities all the way to Staden to an Airbnb.
An Airbnb?
Yeah.
Okay. Can we go there now?
Yeah, sure. We're almost there.
Okay, so this is it. Let's go and see if anybody's there. Okay. Has somebody brought an umbrella? Goodness me. Rented van, rented house. We were getting the picture. Whoever was behind this was leaving a very light footprint.
It's quite anonymous. You often have like little lockers to enter the place, so you don't even need personal contact. You just book it through Airbnb. Here you go.
The Airbnb is situated behind a high wooden sliding gate. It's a modern, discreet bungalow, barely visible from the road. The police came straight here.
So they did a massive find. They found no less than 480 kilograms of ketamine, 117 kilograms of cocaine, and 63 kilograms of heroin, all nicely stashed in the garage.
Of the building that we're standing next to now. I mean, these are huge amounts of drugs. What's the market value, the street value?
The street value of all the boxes in this garage was no less than 21 million euros, which is huge. Normally they only find this in the port of Antwerp, not in an Airbnb in Staden.
As well as the drugs in the house, they found 2 British nationals. Another 6 were tracked down later. And after checking phone and ferry records, Belgian police discovered the British gang had made around 10 further crossings back and forth to the UK undetected. We left rainy Flanders behind and headed for a meeting with Belgium's most senior drug enforcement officer.